The darkness enveloped the porch where Abigail Pierce sat motionless, her silhouette barely visible against the backdrop of the Montana night in 1875. The vast emptiness of the prairie seemed to mirror the hollow feeling in her chest as she rocked slowly in her wooden chair, the creak of the floorboards beneath her the only sound for miles around. It had been 3 months since they'd buried Edward, and each night since, she found herself here, sitting in the darkness as if waiting for something she couldn't name. The distant thunder of hooves broke the stillness of the night. Abigail tensed, her hand instinctively reaching for the shotgun propped against the wall beside her. In these parts, unexpected visitors after sundown rarely brought good news. She watched as a lone rider approached, the outline of his form gradually taking shape against the star-studded sky. "Evening, madam," the stranger called out, his voice carrying across the yard as he slowed his horse to a stop at her fence line. "Hope I'm not intruding." "You're on private property," Abigail replied, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "State your business." The man dismounted with an easy grace that spoke of a lifetime spent in the saddle. "Name's Jack Armstrong. I'm looking for shelter for the night. There's a storm coming in from the west, and your place is the first I've come across in 20 miles. As if to confirm his words, a flash of lightning illuminated the horizon, revealing the man's features for a brief moment, a strong jawline partially hidden beneath a short beard, kind eyes beneath the brim of his worn hat. "The nearest town is Willow Creek, about 15 miles east," she said, still wary. "I know, madam," he replied, taking a tentative step forward. "But my horse is tired and that storm's moving fast. I can pay for your trouble and I'll be gone at first light." Abigail considered him carefully. There was something in his manner that didn't suggest danger, a respectful distance, hands visible at his sides. After a moment's hesitation, she lowered the shotgun slightly. "You can sleep in the barn," she conceded, "but I'll be keeping this close," she added, patting the shotgun. "That's fair," Jack nodded, reaching for something in his saddlebag. "Mind if I light this? It's mighty dark out here." Before she could respond, he struck a match and lit a small brass lantern. The warm golden glow spread across the yard, illuminating both their faces properly for the first time. Abigail was struck by the kindness in his eyes, the way the light softened the weathered lines of his face. "You're sitting here in the dark," he observed gently, not as a question but a statement filled with a quiet understanding that took her by surprise. "I prefer it that way," she replied, though the truth was more complicated. The kerosene had run out 2 days ago, and the nearest general store was a half-day's ride away, a journey she'd been putting off since Edward's passing. Jack approached the steps, lantern in hand, moving slowly as if giving her time to object. When she didn't, he set the lantern on the porch railing, casting a soft glow over the weathered boards. "Sometimes the darkness feels safer," he said quietly. "Less to see, less to feel." The simple observation struck a chord deep within Abigail. For months, neighbors and well-meaning townspeople had offered her platitudes and advice, but none had simply acknowledged the comfort sometimes found in absence. "Your barn's over that way?" Jack asked, nodding toward a structure visible in the lantern light. "Yes," Abigail replied, suddenly reluctant to send him away. It had been so long since she'd spoken to another soul. "But I have some stew left from supper." "It's not much, but you're welcome to it before you settle in for the night." A smile touched the corners of Jack's mouth, warming his features. "That's mighty kind, madam." "Abigail," she offered, surprising herself. "Abigail Pierce." "Well, Mrs. Pierce, I'd be grateful for that stew." "It's Miss now," she corrected him softly. "My husband died 3 months ago." Understanding dawned in Jack's eyes. "I'm sorry for your loss." Inside the small farmhouse, Abigail lit a candle from Jack's lantern and busied herself with reheating the stew over the cookstove. Jack removed his hat, revealing thick brown hair that curled slightly at the ends, and sat at the kitchen table, his tall frame making the modest furniture seem smaller. "What brings you to these parts, Mr. Armstrong?" she asked, partly out of genuine curiosity and partly to fill the strange intimacy of having a man in her kitchen after months of solitude. "Jack, please," he replied, rubbing a hand across his beard. "I've been driving cattle up from Texas, delivered them to a ranch about 30 miles west of here. Now I'm just making my way back toward Cheyenne. Got some business there before winter sets in." Abigail nodded, placing a bowl of stew and a piece of cornbread before him. "It's a long journey to make alone." "Been on my own a good while now," he said, waiting for her to sit before beginning to eat. "Started ranching with my father in Texas after the war, but lost the land when he passed. Been working as a hired hand and cattle driver since." "The war claimed many things," Abigail said softly, thinking of her own father who never returned from Gettysburg. They ate in companionable silence, the storm growing closer, occasional flashes of lightning illuminating the windows. When they finished, Jack insisted on helping with the dishes, a courtesy that both surprised and touched her. "Your husband," Jack ventured cautiously as he dried a plate, "was he a rancher too?" "A farmer," Abigail replied, her hands stilling in the wash basin. "We came out here from Pennsylvania 5 years ago. Edward had dreams of building something grand from this land." She gestured vaguely toward the window, where their modest fields lay in darkness. "He took ill last winter. By spring he was gone, and you've been managing alone since then." There was no judgment in his question, only genuine curiosity, which is why Abigail found herself answering truthfully. "Trying to. The crops this year aren't what they should be. I'm not sure how much longer I can hold on." The first heavy raindrops began to patter against the roof, and a gust of wind rattled the windows. "Looks like that storm's arrived," Jack observed, hanging the dish towel to dry. "I should head to the barn before it really lets loose." Abigail walked him to the door, lantern in hand. The wind had picked up considerably, bending the tall grass in waves across the yard. Another flash of lightning revealed dark, ominous clouds rolling overhead. "You sure you'll be all right out there?" she asked. Eyeing the increasingly violent weather, Jack smiled reassuringly. "I've weathered worse. Thank you for the meal and shelter, Miss Pierce." "Abigail," she corrected him again, returning his smile with a small one of her own, the first that had felt genuine in months. He tipped his hat, then dashed through the rain toward the barn, the lantern light bobbing in the darkness until it disappeared inside the structure. Abigail stood in the doorway longer than necessary, watching the rain fall in sheets, illuminated by frequent lightning strikes. Eventually, she closed the door against the storm, surprised at how empty the house suddenly felt again. Sleep evaded Abigail that night as the storm raged. She lay awake, listening to the thunder and thinking about the stranger in her barn. There was something about Jack Armstrong that felt familiar, though she was certain they'd never met before. Perhaps it was the quiet strength he emanated, or the respect with which he'd treated her, not with pity, as the townsfolk did, but with a simple acknowledgement of her circumstances. A particularly violent gust of wind rattled the entire house, followed by a crashing sound from outside. Abigail bolted upright, lighting a candle and moving to the window. In the brief illumination provided by lightning, she saw that part of the barn roof had given way under the weight of a fallen tree branch. Without hesitation, she threw on a coat over her nightgown, grabbed the candle, and rushed out into the storm. Rain immediately soaked her as she ran across the yard, her feet splashing through growing puddles. "Jack," she called out as she reached the barn, pushing the partially blocked door open with her shoulder. Inside, she found chaos. Rain poured through the damaged roof, and loose hay scattered across the floor. Her 2 horses were nickering nervously in their stalls. Jack's horse was also agitated, pulling at its tether. "Jack," she called again, raising her candle higher. "Over here," came his response, and she turned to find him attempting to move a large section of the fallen roof beam. "Stay back, it's not stable." Ignoring his warning, Abigail set down her candle on a dry shelf and moved to help him. Together, They managed to shift the beam enough to secure it temporarily with some rope and nails that Jack found in her toolbox. "That should hold until morning," he said, wiping rain and sweat from his face. "But this whole section needs proper repairs." "At least the animals are safe," Abigail replied, suddenly aware that she was standing in her nightgown, soaked through and clinging to her form. Jack seemed to realize this at the same moment, quickly averting his eyes and offering her his jacket. "You're soaked to the bone," he said, concern evident in his voice. "You shouldn't stay out here." "Neither should you," she found herself saying. "That roof could still collapse further. You'd better come back to the house." Jack hesitated, clearly torn between propriety and practical concerns. Another crack of thunder decided for him as more rain began pouring through a new opening in the roof. "If you're sure it's all right," he conceded, gathering his few belongings. They made a dash back to the house through the driving rain, arriving at the porch breathless and thoroughly drenched. Inside, Abigail stoked the fire in the stove to bring warmth to the kitchen while Jack stood awkwardly by the door, water pooling around his boots. "I've got some of Edward's clothes," she offered, disappearing into the bedroom before returning with a simple shirt and trousers. "They might be a bit small, but they're dry." "Thank you," Jack replied, accepting them gratefully. Abigail changed in her bedroom while Jack used the small back room. When they reconvened in the kitchen, the absurdity of their situation, two strangers in borrowed clothes at midnight during a raging storm, struck them both simultaneously, and they shared a genuine laugh that surprised Abigail with its warmth. "I'll make some coffee," she offered, needing something to do with her hands. As the coffee brewed, they sat at the kitchen table, the lantern between them casting a warm glow over their faces. Outside, the storm continued its assault, but inside, a different kind of energy was building, a tentative connection neither had expected to find. "Tell me about Texas," Abigail said, curious about the life this man had led. Jack spoke of vast open plains, cattle drives that lasted weeks, sleeping under stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch. His stories painted pictures of a life so different from her own that Abigail found herself captivated, asking questions and listening intently to his answers. In turn, he asked about her life, not just her time on the farm with Edward, but before that, her childhood in Pennsylvania, her dreams and disappointments. Hours passed as they talked, the storm gradually subsiding outside as dawn approached. "I haven't talked this much in." "I can't remember how long," Abigail admitted as she noticed the first hint of gray light through the window. "Me neither," Jack confessed, a smile crinkling the corners of his eyes. "Most nights on the trail, my only conversation is with my horse, and he's not nearly as good a listener." They shared another laugh, and Abigail realized with a start that the hollow feeling in her chest had momentarily abated, replaced by something warm and unfamiliar, or perhaps just long forgotten. As promised, Jack prepared to leave when true daylight arrived. The storm had passed, leaving behind a washed clean world and considerable damage to the barn roof. Jack insisted on staying to help with repairs before continuing his journey. "I can't ask you to do that," Abigail protested as they stood surveying the damage. "You're not asking." "I'm offering," he replied simply. "Besides, I know a thing or two about building. My father and I put up 3 barns back in Texas." Despite her initial reluctance, Abigail accepted his help. One day of repairs stretched into 2, then 3, as they discovered more damage than initially apparent. Jack slept in the back room, and they fell into an easy routine of working together during the day and talking by lantern light in the evenings. On the 4th day, as they were finishing the roof repairs, a wagon approached from the direction of town. Abigail recognized Joseph Miller, the general store owner, and his wife Martha. "Abigail," Martha called out, waving as Joseph brought the wagon to a stop. "We were worried about you after that storm, thought we'd check." "Oh." Her voice faltered as she noticed Jack descending the ladder from the barn roof. "Good afternoon," Jack greeted them, tipping his hat politely. Joseph's eyes narrowed slightly as he looked between Jack and Abigail. "Didn't realize you had company, Mrs. Pierce." "Miss Pierce," Jack corrected automatically, then looked embarrassed at his forwardness. Abigail stepped forward, conscious of how this must appear to her neighbors. "Mr. Armstrong was caught in the storm while passing through. He's been kind enough to help with the barn roof that was damaged." Martha's expression softened with understanding, though Joseph still looked skeptical. "That's fortunate timing," he remarked. "We've brought some supplies, thought you might need them after the storm." "That's very kind," Abigail replied, genuinely touched by their thoughtfulness. They unloaded the supplies, including the kerosene Abigail had been meaning to purchase. Throughout the interaction, she was acutely aware of Jack's presence beside her, how naturally he stood there, how easily he conversed with the Millers about the storm damage around the county. After the Millers departed, promising to spread word that Abigail was faring well, an awkward silence fell between her and Jack. "They seem like good people," he finally said as they returned to work on the barn. "They are," Abigail agreed. "They've been checking on me since Edward passed. Martha brings food sometimes, and Joseph has helped with some of the heavier farm work." Jack nodded, hammering a nail with perhaps more force than necessary. "Good to have neighbors like that." "Yes," she replied, sensing something unspoken in his tone. "Though I think they may have gotten the wrong impression about this situation." Jack paused, meeting her eyes directly. Would that be so terrible? The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications neither was quite ready to address. Abigail looked away first, her heart beating rapidly in a way it hadn't for a very long time. "The roof is almost finished," she said instead of answering. "You'll be able to continue your journey soon." Jack returned to his hammering without response, and they worked in silence until dusk began to fall. That evening, their usual easy conversation was replaced by a tension that made the small kitchen feel even smaller. Jack spoke of his plans to reach Cheyenne within the week, and Abigail discussed her intentions for the coming harvest, both of them carefully avoiding any mention of his imminent departure or what the past few days had meant. As night fell fully, Abigail lit the newly filled lantern, its glow spreading across the porch where they sat listening to the chorus of crickets and watching fireflies dance across the yard. "I never thanked you properly," Abigail said suddenly, breaking the silence. "Not just for the barn, but for bringing light back." Jack turned to her, his expression softened by the lantern glow. "I think you had the light in you all along, Abigail. Sometimes we just need someone to strike the match." Their eyes met, and something unspoken passed between them, an acknowledgement of the unexpected connection that had formed in just a few short days. Slowly, cautiously, Jack reached across the space between their chairs and took her hand in his. Abigail didn't pull away. "I should leave tomorrow," he said, his thumb gently stroking the back of her hand. "That's what I planned." "Yes," she whispered, though the thought of returning to her solitary existence after these days of companionship made her heart ache. "But plans can change," he continued, his voice low and earnest. "I don't have to be in Cheyenne for another 2 weeks. There's still the north field fence that needs mending, and you mentioned the well was giving you trouble." Hope fluttered in Abigail's chest, but caution tempered it. "Jack, you don't owe me anything more. You've already done so much." "This isn't about owing," he replied, shifting to face her more directly. "Abigail, I've spent years drifting from place to place, never staying long enough to put down roots, but these past few days." He paused, searching for the right words. "These past few days have felt more like home than anywhere I've been since before the war." The confession hung in the air, raw and honest, and Abigail found herself squeezing his hand in response. "I know," she said softly. "For me too." The next morning dawned clear and bright, a stark contrast to the storm that had brought Jack to her door. They worked side by side on the north field fence, the physical labor providing a welcome distraction from the emotional currents flowing between them. By midday, they had made significant progress. and Abigail suggested they break for lunch beneath the shade of a large oak tree. As they ate the simple meal of bread, cheese, and apples, Jack told her more about his plans in Cheyenne, a business opportunity with an old Army friend who was starting a horse breeding operation. "He's offered me a partnership," Jack explained, leaning back against the tree trunk. "It would mean settling in one place, building something lasting." "That sounds like a good opportunity," Abigail said, ignoring the pang in her chest at the thought of him building a life elsewhere. "It could be," he agreed, then hesitated before continuing. "Abigail, there's something I've been wanting to ask you." Before he could continue, they were interrupted by the sound of approaching riders. 3 men on horseback were making their way across the field toward them, moving with a purpose that immediately put Jack on alert. "Stay here," he said, rising to his feet and positioning himself slightly in front of Abigail. As the riders drew closer, Abigail recognized the lead man with a sinking feeling. Thomas Blackburn was a wealthy rancher who owned most of the land surrounding her small farm. He had made several offers to buy her property since Edward's death, each more insistent than the last. "Mrs. Pierce," Blackburn called out as they reined in their horses a few yards away. "And who might this be?" "Jack Armstrong," Jack introduced himself, his posture relaxed but vigilant. "Armstrong," Blackburn repeated, sizing him up. "Don't believe I've seen you around these parts before." "Just passing through," Jack replied evenly. "Helping Miss Pierce with some repairs after the storm." Blackburn's eyebrows raised at Jack's emphasis on "Miss," and a calculating look crossed his features as he glanced between them. "Well, that's neighborly of you," he said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Miss Pierce, I've come to discuss my offer again. After that storm, I imagine you're finding it even more difficult to maintain this place on your own." "I appreciate your concern, Mr. Blackburn," Abigail replied, stepping forward to stand beside Jack. "But as I've told you before, this farm is not for sale." Blackburn's smile tightened. "I understand sentiment, madam, truly I do. But sentiment won't pay for repairs or put food on your table come winter. I'm prepared to increase my offer by 20%. "The answer is still no," Abigail said firmly. One of Blackburn's companions, a rough-looking man with a scar across his cheek, leaned forward in his saddle. "Boss, maybe we should just—" "That's enough, Davis," Blackburn cut him off, then turned his attention back to Abigail. "I'll give you more time to consider. The offer stands until the end of the month after that." He shrugged, leaving the implication hanging in the air. Jack stepped forward slightly. "Miss Pierce has given you her answer, sir. I suggest you respect it." A tense silence followed as Blackburn assessed Jack with cold eyes. Finally, he nodded curtly. "We'll be on our way then. Good day to you both." He tipped his hat and turned his horse, his men following close behind. Once they were out of earshot, Abigail let out a shaky breath. "He's been persistent since Edward died. This land connects his 2 largest properties. He wants to combine them into one big ranch." Jack watched the retreating riders with a thoughtful expression. "Has he ever gone beyond making offers? Any threats or incidents?" Abigail hesitated. "Nothing I could prove, but there have been occurrences. Cattle breaking through fences into my crops, water from the creek being diverted before it reaches my property during dry spells. And the local law. Sheriff Tate is a good man, but he can't do much without proof. Besides, Blackburn employs half the county and bankrolls the other half." Jack's jaw tightened. "I don't like the way he looked at you or the way his men were positioned." "I've handled Thomas Blackburn for months," Abigail assured him, though she couldn't deny the comfort she felt at Jack's protective concern. "What you were handling alone and what we're handling together are 2 different matters," he replied, his eyes still tracking the distant riders. "I think I'll stay a bit longer than planned if that's all right with you." Relief flooded through Abigail, though she tried not to show it too plainly. "I wouldn't object to the company or the help with the well." Jack's serious expression softened as he looked at her, a smile warming his features. "Then it's settled." The days that followed fell into a rhythm of work and companionship that felt increasingly natural to them both. Jack's temporary stay extended from days into weeks as they tackled repairs around the farm together. He taught Abigail better techniques for maintaining the equipment, while she shared her knowledge of the crops and soil. In the evenings, they would sit on the porch, the lantern glowing between them as they talked about everything and nothing: childhood memories, hopes for the future, books they had read, places they had seen. Sometimes they would simply sit in comfortable silence, watching the stars emerge in the vast Montana sky. It was during one such evening, nearly 3 weeks after the storm that had brought Jack to her door, that Abigail finally asked the question that had been on her mind. "Your friend in Cheyenne," she began hesitantly. "Won't he be wondering where you are?" Jack nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I sent a letter last week from Willow Creek explaining I'd be delayed." "Oh," Abigail replied, unsure whether to feel relief or concern about this extension of what was meant to be a temporary arrangement. "I told him I might not be coming at all," Jack continued quietly, his eyes finding hers in the lantern light. Abigail's breath caught in her throat. "Jack." "I know it's sudden," he said, turning fully toward her. "We've only known each other a short time, but Abigail, I've never felt so at home as I have these past weeks with you." The sincerity in his voice made her heart race. "I feel it too," she admitted, the words barely above a whisper. "But your partnership in Cheyenne, there are other opportunities," he interrupted gently. "There's land available near Willow Creek, good land. I've been asking around. With what I've saved and my experience, I could start something there." Hope blossomed in Abigail's chest, but caution made her hesitate. "And what about this place, my farm?" "That depends on what you want," Jack replied, reaching for her hand. "I'm not asking to take over your life or your decisions, Abigail. I'm just asking for a chance to be part of them." Tears welled in her eyes at the simple honesty of his words. For so long after Edward's death, she had existed in a state of suspended animation, neither living fully nor completely giving up. Jack had reawakened something in her she thought was gone forever: the capacity to look forward rather than backward, to imagine possibilities rather than merely endure realities. "I want you to stay," she said finally, her voice stronger than she expected. "Not just to help with the farm or to deal with Blackburn, but because when you're here, I remember what it feels like to be truly alive again." Jack's expression brightened with emotion as he gently squeezed her hand. "Then I'll stay, for as long as you'll have me." In the golden glow of the lantern, he leaned toward her slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished. Instead, Abigail moved to meet him, their lips coming together in a kiss that felt both like an ending and a beginning: the closing of one chapter of solitude and grief, and the opening of another filled with possibility and hope. The following morning, they rode together into Willow Creek. The small town buzzed with activity as they made their way down the main street toward the general store. Abigail was acutely aware of the curious glances they received, but for once, she didn't mind the attention. There was something affirming about being seen alongside Jack, about no longer being just the widow Pierce, but a woman with a future unfolding before her. In the general store, Martha Miller greeted them warmly, her eyes twinkling with barely contained curiosity as she watched them shop together for supplies. "Mr. Armstrong, you've certainly extended your stay in our little corner of Montana," she remarked as she wrapped their purchases in brown paper. "Yes, madam," Jack replied with an easy smile. "Found some compelling reasons to stick around." His eyes met Abigail's across the counter, and the warmth in his gaze made her cheeks flush. Martha didn't miss the exchange, her smile widening as she handed them their packages. "Well, we're all mighty glad to see Abigail in town again," she said. "She's been keeping to herself too much these past months." Outside the store, they encountered Sheriff Tate, who tipped his hat respectfully. "Miss Pierce, Mr. Armstrong, fine day, isn't it?" "Indeed it is, Sheriff," Abigail agreed. "I hear Blackburn paid you a visit last week," the lawman continued, his expression growing more serious. "Any trouble?" Jack stepped forward slightly. "Nothing we couldn't handle, but he seemed determined about buying Abigail's land." The sheriff nodded thoughtfully. "Blackburn usually gets what he wants around here one way or another. You two be careful out there. Let me know if anything unusual happens." "We appreciate that, Sheriff," Jack replied, shaking the man's hand. As they loaded their supplies into Abigail's wagon, Jack noticed a "land for sale" sign posted outside the town's small bank. He studied it for a moment before turning to Abigail with a question in his eyes. "Would you mind if I spoke to the banker for a few minutes?" "There's something I'd like to inquire about." "Go ahead," she encouraged him. "I'll finish up here." While Jack was in the bank, Abigail encountered several other townspeople, all of whom seemed unusually friendly and interested in her well-being. She realized with some surprise that the presence of Jack in her life had changed how others perceived her, no longer an object of pity, but someone reclaiming her place in the community. Jack emerged from the bank looking pleased, though he deflected her questions about his business there with a smile and a promise to explain later. They completed their errands and began the journey home, the wagon loaded with supplies and a sense of shared purpose that hadn't existed before. That evening, after supper, Jack led Abigail to the porch where they had spent so many nights talking. The lantern was lit, casting its familiar warm glow over them as they sat side by side in the rocking chairs. "I have something to show you," Jack said, reaching into his pocket and producing a folded document. "This is what I was doing at the bank today." Abigail took the paper curiously, unfolding it to reveal a deed for 100 acres of land just outside Willow Creek, with Jack Armstrong listed as the new owner. "You bought land?" she asked, surprised at how quickly he had acted on his words from the night before. Jack nodded, his expression a mixture of excitement and nervousness. "It's good grazing land with access to the creek and enough flat terrain for a modest house and barn. It's about 20 minutes' ride from here." Abigail studied the document, trying to process what this meant. "So you're really staying in Montana?" "Yes," he confirmed, watching her face carefully. "But Abigail, there's more to it than that." He took a deep breath, then surprised her by slipping from his chair to kneel before her, taking both her hands in his. "I know this is fast, probably too fast by most standards. We've only known each other for weeks, not years. But in those weeks, I've discovered more about what I want in life than in all my years of wandering. And what I want, more than anything, is a future with you." Tears welled in Abigail's eyes as she understood what he was saying. "I'm not asking you to leave your farm or give up your independence," Jack continued earnestly. "This land I bought, it could be a fresh start for both of us together, or we could build our life here, on the land you and Edward worked. Either way, I want to stand beside you, not in front of you or behind you." He reached into his pocket again and pulled out a simple gold band. "Abigail Pierce, would you do me the great honor of becoming my wife?" Time seemed to stop as Abigail looked into his hopeful eyes. She thought of the darkness that had surrounded her before Jack arrived, how she had sat alone on this very porch night after night, shrouded in grief and isolation. She thought of the moment he had lit the lantern, how that simple act of bringing light had somehow illuminated not just her porch but her heart as well. "Yes," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Yes, Jack Armstrong, I will marry you." Joy spread across his features as he slipped the ring onto her finger, then rose to embrace her. Their kiss was a promise, a pledge to face whatever came next, whether challenges from Blackburn or the ordinary trials of building a life together side by side, their combined strength greater than either alone. The wedding took place 2 months later in the small church in Willow Creek. The entire community turned out for the ceremony, filling the pews and spilling onto the church steps. Abigail wore a simple cream-colored dress that Martha Miller had helped her make, with wildflowers woven into her hair instead of a veil. As she walked down the aisle toward Jack, who waited for her with undisguised adoration, Abigail felt the final shadows of grief lifting from her heart. Edward would always be a part of her past, but Jack was her future, a future brighter than she could have imagined on those dark nights alone. They spoke their vows clearly and firmly, promises to love and cherish, to support and respect each other through whatever life might bring. When the Reverend pronounced them husband and wife, the church erupted in cheers and applause, a celebration of new beginnings that continued at the reception held on Abigail's, now their farm. Under a canopy of lanterns that transformed the yard into a magical space, they danced their first dance as husband and wife, surrounded by well-wishers. Even Sheriff Tate was present, informing them discreetly that Blackburn had apparently abandoned his interest in Abigail's property and turned his attention to lands farther north. As evening fell and the guests began to depart, Jack and Abigail found themselves once again alone on the porch. Jack lit the brass lantern that had become so symbolic of their relationship, its familiar glow enveloping them in warmth as they looked out over their land. "Happy?" Jack asked, his arm around her waist as they stood together in the gentle light. "More than I ever thought possible again," Abigail replied, leaning into his embrace. "It's strange to think that if not for that storm, you might have ridden right past our gate." "I don't believe that," Jack said, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Some things are meant to be, storm or no storm. I would have found my way to you somehow." Abigail smiled at the romantic notion, allowing herself to believe it was true. From darkness into light, from solitude into partnership, from grief into joy, their journey together was only beginning, illuminated by the same lantern that had first brought them together on a stormy Montana night. As dawn approached on their wedding night, they still sat on the porch, talking of their plans for the future, the crops they would plant, the cattle Jack would raise on his new land, the children they hoped would one day fill their home with laughter and life. The first rays of sunlight crested the eastern hills, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Jack reached over and turned down the lantern, no longer needed as natural light filled the world around them. "A new day," he said, taking her hand in his. "A new beginning," Abigail replied, her heart full of gratitude for the cowboy who had lit a lantern in her darkness and stayed until dawn and beyond.